Hello, this presentation is on qualitative data analysis. Today, I'm going to be going over coding, thematic analysis, and how to report your outcomes and findings. There is a previous video that went through how to write up your data analysis proposal, how to write up the plan for doing data analysis. This is for learners who are actually ready to do their data analysis. This may also be helpful for learners who are in their proposal phase and want to understand further how to do data analysis as you're writing up your plan. So for the most part today, I'm going to be focusing on what you're going to do once you actually have collected all your data and you're going to start doing data analysis. So first, it's so important to make sure that you understand the systematic approach for how you're going to be doing thematic analysis. So thematic analysis is a set of techniques used to analyze textual data and to start eliciting some type of themes from that data. So you're going to be going through some type of coding process. You're going to be examining the quotes that you're capturing or segments of data, and then you're going to put describing what those perspectives of participants are. And remember, if you're doing qualitative inquiry, you're looking at either the perspective, the perception, the opinions, or the attitudes of participants, where they're giving you information related to your expertise or experience. So when you're doing thematic analysis, the whole goal is that you're going to be looking at the text of the transcripts that you have from collecting your data. And there's some generic strategies that are part of almost every approach to data analysis. First, you're going to immerse yourself in the data. And then you're going to do some preliminary or informant analysis. You're going to be doing some type of memoing or maybe note taking or looking to make sure that you understand what participants are saying. You're then going to start looking for codes that you can capture segments of data or maybe some themes or some patterns that you see emerging. So you're going to go in and really understand your data. This starts actually with cleaning up your transcripts, to be honest. When you go in and you're listening to the recording of the interview, and then you're ensuring the accuracy of the transcripts, correcting any punctuation, correcting any spelling, correct any word errors or transcription errors, removing any timestamps. So you're listening to those interviews, you're cleaning up and reading and reviewing the transcripts and verifying those for accuracy. And then you're basically going to be looking at what themes are emerging. And then you're looking at how do the findings then relate to your conceptual or theoretical framework. So there are various stages of thematic analysis. And again, a theme is just capturing something important about the data in relation to your project or your research question. So the four phases of this thematic analysis are the initialization phase, construction phase, rectification phase, and finalization phase. In the initialization stage, you're going to be doing the transcription, you're going to start coding, and you're going to start looking at doing some reflective notes. Then in the construction phase, you're going to be classifying the data, comparing it, labeling it through the coding process, translating it to see what the meanings are across multiple participants, maybe defining codes or describing what multiple participants are actually saying in relation to the project or research question. Then you're going to do rectification, and that's where you're going to look at emerging and distancing. You're going to look at the data and you want to ensure that you're verifying the accuracy of how you've coded or clustered or categorized the data and make sure that you are capturing in a way that everything is in context and are accurately reflecting the view of participants. And then you're going to go through a stabilizing phase where you start looking at the emerging themes, coming up with the themes, and then finalizing those themes. Usually your initial themes are not actually the themes that you're going to be writing about. Your initial themes are things that you start to notice, but then as you continue to work on and analyzing your data, you start to figure out more nuances, more relationships among the concepts, you start to see more patterns, and you make sure that your themes are fully robust, and again, are the views of participants without your own bias or your own interpretation where you are trying to fit the findings into any preconceived notions that you have. And then the finalization phase is when you're actually writing up your results and developing the storyline. You're explaining normally a theme is a thematic statement. You have a statement that is the theme that answers the project question, but then you describe it in detail. How did the theme emerge? This is the story that emerged. This is the actual view of participants as it relates to this theme. So for each of these phases, you want to make sure that you are using as much as possible the methods and techniques available for qualitative inquiry to understand the perspective of participants, in their responses to your interview questions. So if you're doing qualitative research, you can have a variety of types of data. And I list them all here because as you are reading about qualitative inquiry or qualitative research, you're going to see all of these things. But here at Capella, you're going to be mostly relying on transcripts or maybe any notes that you took during the interviews that you did with your participants. In the construction phase, you're going to be coding the data, organizing it, taking codes and classifying those into categories. And keep in mind, codes are just labels. Codes are labels that you create. So oftentimes I see students say that I counted the number of words. These were the words that came up a lot. So these are my codes. And then when they're doing their write-up, they're saying this is how many times codes were spoken by participants. That's technically inaccurate since participants don't speak codes. Codes, again, are labels that you create. It could be frequent words that they had. It could be just a label or a concept that groups like things together. So for example, if I'm doing a study on project management and someone talks about how to start projects, I may have a code that says startup. And then anytime they talk about starting a project, I put it there. Anytime that they talk about strategies for successfully completing projects, I may put success strategies as a code and start classifying segments of data under that individual code. So again, codes are labels that are assigned some type of meaning or description where you're taking extracts of data and assigning it to those individual codes. And then in the verification process, this is where you're going to go through and you're going to immerse yourselves in the data, take a step back to make sure that you're watching for any bias. That is a crucial step for self-correcting or making sure that the actual information that you're trying to write down or any preliminary themes and so forth are the actual representation of what someone is saying. For example, if in this phase, if I'm doing analysis and I have a project management study and I'm looking at people's perspectives on successfully completing projects, I may have asked them questions on what they do in order to start a project. And so I'm looking at all my transcripts and I see one person talked about creating a work breakdown structure. Another participant talked about using a list of every step that needs to be done using some type of work breakdown structure. And 3 other participants mentioned using a work breakdown structure. So I see a pattern there. I see a pattern for how did you start a project. 5 out of my 12 participants mentioned that they use a work breakdown structure. So when I start to write a theme, if I state it's important to start with a work breakdown structure, that's actually not the view of participants. That is my bias. Just because I heard 5 people talk about work breakdown structures doesn't mean it's important. So that's what you're doing in this rectification phase. You're looking and saying, am I putting in my own spin or interpretation of what they're saying? Or am I actually representing on what participants said? Is that what my theme really is? So again, if I have 5 people talking about work breakdown structures, I could say a theme would be some participants express that using a work breakdown structure has led them to successfully completing projects, if that's the actual view of participants. But again, I could not say it's important to start with a work breakdown structure or starting with a work breakdown structure is critical because no participants actually said that. So it's really important that as you are working through your data analysis, that you're accurately reflecting what participants said. So once you finalize themes and you are confident that they reflect the actual perspectives of those participants, then you can go ahead and move to the finalization phase. And that's where you are going to start writing your themes and you're going to start explaining the storyline or the narrative or the holistic review of what participants said in relation to your interview questions that tie into your project question. So this is when you are actually developing the story and writing up your data analysis. So when you're doing thematic analysis, it's important to follow the 6 steps outlined here by Braun and Clark. You're going to familiarize yourself with the data. You're going to start looking for initial codes and start assigning segments to those of data to those codes. You're going to group like codes together in categories. Then you can start searching for themes. And when you're searching for themes, it's really important to take a step back and keep in mind that codes and categories and the data assigned to those codes and categories are just a way to help you organize the data. So when you're actually looking for a theme, you're taking a step back and looking at all of your data and coming up with theme number one. Then you're taking a step back and looking at all of your data again and looking at theme number two. It's really important not to do things where you're taking a category and saying, this category is theme one, this other category is theme two. That's segmenting your data. If you're doing that, you're just collapsing categories and calling it a theme instead of looking at your overall data. And because if you silo your data, if each category becomes a theme, that just means each theme is ignoring huge other segments of the rest of your data. So for example, if I'm doing a study on employee engagement and I have a category with codes that all deal with engagement, the odds of including that data from those codes and categories in every theme are high. So it's make sure that when you're searching for your themes, you're looking across your entire data set. Step number 4 is to review the themes. Step number 5 is defining and naming the themes. And step number 6 is producing the actual report. So what is a code? A code is just a label that you create. It could be done through a manual coding process where you're doing open coding through inductive coding. You're going through and saying, all right, I'm reading the transcripts. This is a new concept that relates to the project question. I'm going to capture this quote, label this quote, highlight this quote, and I'm going to put it under a code or a label. Then I'm going to group similar quotes from this participant and all other participants when I'm reviewing a transcript. And I'll show you some examples because I think it will be good to actually view it. So for the most part, a code isn't a word that a participant spoke, even though it may be. You may develop some initial codes based on some word frequency that you noticed in the document when you're reviewing your transcripts. But for the most part, a code is something that you create that is a label. There's different techniques for coding that could be color coding, writing in the margins, using a word processing program. I think this is really one of the best ways to do coding, where you just have 2 columns. Column number 1 is your transcripts. Column number 2 is where you put the code, and then you just highlight part of your transcript, use some color coding to label each of those. And then you can organize in another document, whether it's Word or Excel, where you're taking your codes and then you're taking for each code, you have all the quotes that you assign to that individual code. And then you start to look for codes that are similar, and you can group those together under categories in order to further organize your data. So you may have chosen to do inductive or deductive coding. Deductive coding means you had a preliminary coding structure, often based on your framework. Inductive coding is an open coding process where you're basically taking all of your data, you're just reading through it and developing codes as you read through it. So there are various levels of analysis. So the first one is where you're going through your raw data and you're moving those into fully cleaned up, developed transcripts. So this is where you de-identify the participants. So anytime someone mentions their company name or their individual name, or there may be their name in the actual transcript itself, you're going to remove that and replace that with the pseudonym such as participant 1 in order to protect their anonymity. You want to make sure that the transcripts are in complete sentences. You want to have it in a response format. So interviewer, and then you list the question, and then you have the response in a paragraph format. So within the paragraph, you have proper punctuation, you have proper spelling, you ensure it's accurately reflecting what the participant said, not any type of auto transcription that occurred, removing any timestamps that are embedded within participant responses. That just makes it easier to read and for easier data analysis. And you can edit out any unnecessary filler words such as or like, as you are cleaning up those transcripts. Once you have your transcripts all cleaned up, you've already gone through them, you've ensured their accuracy, you've maybe shared them with participants to make sure it reflected what they actually said, then you can start doing your coding. Coding can be manual coding or software-assisted coding. Most of our students use manual coding. That's where you're going through and you're just coding by hand. This really allows for a deep immersion in the data and a nuanced understanding of participants' responses. Usually, if someone uses software-assisted coding, they end up doing additional coding after that, or they may do some manual coding and then compare how the manual coding compared to the software-assisted coding. Oftentimes, people may use word counts to develop codes. This is optional. If you're struggling in order to understand the concepts that are coming across, look for some key words that have developed. I was working with a student once who had their transcripts. They kind of did their coding. They looked at they developed categories and they came up with some themes. But then when I was looking at their actual transcripts and reading through those, I noticed the number of times the word challenge, difficulty, um, uh, and frustration, all the barriers came up so many times throughout their transcript where I thought, how is this not part of a theme? This is something that came up quite a bit. And so I had them go and I said, I want you to count the number of times someone said the word difficulty or someone mentioned the number of word challenges and start looking at quotes related to those. And it ended up becoming two of the themes, some of the barriers and challenges associated with the concept related to their study. So word counts can be very helpful as well, identifying things that you want to start to code or some finding quotes or segments of data related to those concepts of frequently used words. So when you're looking at coding and categorizing, keep in mind this is an iterative process. So you're going to do initial coding, you'll review those codes, you'll recode, you'll combine codes, maybe you'll break up some codes, maybe you'll have some subcodes, but you want to make sure whatever you're doing, you're tracking your process. Why? Because you're going to have an audit trail of your analysis and you're going to have to write up your results. So you're going to write up exactly what you did. So explain how you did your coding, any recoding, what happened with all of the quotes that were assigned to each of those codes, when you put them into categories, that you have it traceable which categories are assigned to each codes. And then once you finalize your coding in categories and have your quotes all organized so that you can easily look at them and start looking for patterns, then you can start developing your themes. And themes are just the overarching ideas or patterns that have emerged in the data. They must represent what the actual participants had stated. It's their perspectives, it's their opinions, it's their attitudes, it's what they have said. That's what your themes are. And they should directly be answering and tied and relate to your project question and the purpose of your study. So in the end, themes are related and tied into answering your research or project question. And then normally you can compare those themes to your theoretical or conceptual framework to offer some additional insights or some deeper meanings to what your data actually showed. Let's look at an example of what coding looks like. So if I have an interview abstract, I'm just showing you that here. I'm going through and then looking at what are participants actually saying. So so when I'm reading the transcript, I'm looking at the first part here and they're talking about uncertainty. So I create a code that calls uncertainty. And I think it's really good to use different color highlighting. So that I can see in other transcripts or in this transcript, anytime someone's talking about uncertainty, then I'm assigning it to that code and I can easily see it based on the highlighting. So if they're talking about distrust of experts, I'm going to code that under that code. If they're talking about that terminology is changing, and this is for a study on climate change. So you can see here on the left-hand side, this is the actual response from participants. And I'm just going through and capturing some quotes of what they said, and I'm assigning those to codes. And then anytime that they talk about uncertainty again, I use the same code. When I go read other transcripts, if they're talking about uncertainty, I use yellow and I assign it to that same code. So in this transcript, you'll see that I've highlighted them and that each code is just taking segments of data that are directly answering or related to the project question or the research question. So when you look at the mechanics of coding, Sometimes you may want to do some pre-coding where you're just circling or highlighting things or putting some things in bold or underlining things to start to look for some patterns of things that are maybe codable moments or things that are worthy of your attention. So you may want to just, again, immerse yourself in the data, look at it as much as possible, get familiar with it, re-listen to the interviews if you have to, read the transcripts a number of times, and just start to look for some key meanings that you think are very important. So, consider, what are people doing? What are they trying to accomplish? Why exactly are they doing these things? What strategies are they using? How are they talking about things? What are multiple participants saying about different things related to your project question? But what's really going on? And take some notes and of why you're including some of these key concepts and additional things to look for as you're reading the rest of the transcript. So when you're doing your coding process, you're looking for items that are directly related to answering your project question or aligned with your purpose. While most people are worried about too many codes, some remind us that not enough codes just means you're maybe not segmenting your data enough. And again, all you're doing when you're coding is you are just working to organize your data and capture relevant segments of data and looking at it in clustering things together in order to be able to look for some patterns or some key themes across multiple participants. So usually you come up with a code book or code list. So that will be your code. You can assign a definition to that code. And then when you are actually developing a code book, you may have a code, you may have a short description. You may want to list inclusion and exclusion criteria and different types of things you're putting in this code or not putting in this code. You may want to have some exemplars of some example quotes that best represent the code, and so forth. So when you're working your code list or of how you're coding, feel free to have a nice little table that shows you exactly what codes you're creating and what types of things you're putting in those codes. And that will really, really important as you're writing up your results when you explain your coding process to have this type of audit trail to show exactly what you did during your coding process. So when you're doing your coding, some steps to consider, keep coding in perspective. Keep in mind, it's not the analysis, it's the step towards being able to analyze your data. All you're doing with coding is you're just organizing the data in a way that it can be better understood. So I recommend coding as soon as possible. Some students or some learners will take an interview and then as soon as it's done, they go ahead and code it. Other students will do all of their interviews, get all the transcripts cleaned up, and then go start doing coding. I really don't have a preference. It's really on whatever works best for you. Normally for my learners, I recommend usually just focus on getting your interviews done, getting the transcripts cleaned up, and then once you have all that done, then go ahead and start doing your coding. And that way that you're applying your coding consistently across all of the transcripts because you're doing it all at once. But again, optimize your time and do what's ever best for you. So, but code as soon as possible. You want to make sure that you keep the process moving. Read through your initial set of transcripts. Do it again. Keep immersing yourself in the data. Review your codes. Start looking for themes. Put them into categories. Look for different ways that you can organize the data. Maybe some codes, you only have one code assigned to that. Maybe that's that code can be put into another code or collapsed into one other code. Don't worry about generating what seems to be too many codes. You can always narrow those down to subcodes, or you can always categorize those, or you can always eliminate codes later. So sometimes students will have 100 codes. That might be a lot to analyze in the end. You may want to get that down to 30 or 40 and then put those into 5, 6, or 7 categories. But in the end, there's no hard rule of what you need to come up with. It's whatever best serves you. You're the one who has to analyze the data and understand it. So use the process that best works out for you when determining how many codes or categories to have. But it's really important that you go in and continually recode and recategorizing as you're understanding the data more. You may have grouped a bunch of stuff under strategy, for example, under a code and have a bunch of segments of data or codes, and then you look at it and you're like, oh my gosh, some of these strategies are very nuanced, and they're not really talking about strategies. They're talking about some areas of how they're developing strategies, some areas of how they're using strategies, some are what the outcomes of strategies are. So you might have to take that data and reclassify that under 3 different codes. to kind of break out those more nuances. So go through and remember that once you initially code your data, that may not be your final coding. So recode the data, recategorize it as needed to continually organize it and make sense of your data. And I promise you, by doing that, you will also start to understand your data more. So as I mentioned, there's no specific amount of codes. You can have 50 to 300 codes. It's probably, since you're only interviewing maybe 10 to 12 participants, the odds of having 300 codes or needing 300 codes are unlikely. Normally I see, 20 codes, 30 codes. I think that's probably more feasible. But again, it just depends on whatever works best for you to help organize your data. You may have used software such as Atlas TI and Vivo or Deduce to do a coding. Keep in mind that the software does not analyze your data. The software is just a tool to help you in your analysis process. So it will help you complete some of the steps. It may help you do the coding. It may help you capture initial quotes. It may help you organize it better. But in the end, you're responsible for the analysis of your data, not the software package. I find it's easier just to do manual coding. So when you're looking at what is the difference between codes and themes? Codes are just labels that you create where you're identifying key extracts of data and you're labeling them. Then you're categorizing those to group similar things together. But again, codes and categories don't become themes. The data within them actually becomes the themes. The themes are based on the quotes. When you're writing up your data analysis and doing your data analysis, make sure that distinction is very clear. Your analysis is based on the quotes from the study that you grouped like quotes together, like segments of data together using codes and categories. And then a theme is just basically the answer to the project question or the major patterns that develop in the responses from your participants that relate to your project or research question. So when you look at what is a theme, it's basically just the pattern in some type of semantic content where you're basically looking to summarize or interpret the data in order to show what the actual perspective of your participants actually were. And so it's capturing something important. It's telling the story. I often think of it this way. If you tell someone, I did a study on how to successfully implement project management techniques, and someone said, oh my gosh, what did you learn? These were my 5 themes. It should just explain those 5 themes are what you learned or what the actual study showed. It should be robust enough where it actually could be helpful to participants. So for example, multiple participants stated that using a work breakdown structure to start a project often led to a more organized and successful project and saved costs. But keep in mind, it would need to be something that participants actually said. You're just grouping like concepts together and putting it in a descriptive statement. And then you're telling the story of what participants actually said as it relates to that descriptive thematic statement. So in qualitative analysis, there's no number of instances of number of themes that you have to have. Normally we see 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 themes, just depending on your study and how much data you had and how many different patterns emerged. So when you're looking at an example, your raw data could be this quote from participant 3. So as they say, I often feel overwhelmed by the number of tasks I have to complete. I may label that under workload pressure. I may put this quote along with this code under the category of job-related challenges, where a number of different challenges are created. So I may have like 6 codes that talk about job-related challenges. Work pressure could be one of them. And then I take a step back and I look at all of my data. I look at all my codes, all my categories, all the quotes that are assigned to those, all the notes that I've taken, all the word counts that I've looked at, and say, what were the main themes that came up? And then, so I go from that coding to categorization to now looking for my themes. What do participants consistently report or talk about? And then when I actually do the reporting of it, then I describe it in detail. I explain, this is how the theme emerged. these are some example quotes that relate to this theme. This is what participants actually said. And usually when I write it up, I just like to actually use subheadings that break out each of these factors. So participants constantly reported experiencing overwhelming workloads. I usually have overwhelming workloads as a subheading discussing the theme and explain the quotes that exactly led to this part of the sentence. And high pressure levels of pressure. I may then go through and explain all of the quotes where multiple participants talked about high levels of pressure. And then I may then have a subheading under this theme that shows how this related to burnout. So I will then show the individual quotes where they said this overwhelming pressure and high level of pressure actually led to burnout. So when I have a thematic statement, I explain exactly in my analysis how I developed this sentence. And then I just tell the story. I tell the story of how the theme emerged, what participants actually said, and what overall conclusions can be drawn from all the participants. So when you are looking for patterns, you're looking for some type of similarity. You're looking for the differences. You're looking for the frequency of how often things came up or things that did not come up. You're looking for the sequence of the order of how things occurred. You're looking at their correspondence, how things relate to each other and other activities. So for example, in the previous example, we were looking at that work pressure and how it related to employee burnout. So you're looking at the relationship between those and what the participants actually say. And see if there's any other types where people are saying there's some type of causation. So if people are saying X, Y, and Z led to more turnover, that and it relates to your project question, that could be part of a pattern that you want to discuss in your thematic analysis. So what makes good thematic analysis? Where you have a theme that accurately represents the perspective of participants in relation to your project or research question. So during the coding phase, you want to make sure that each data item has been given equal attention in the coding process, that themes have not been generated from a few examples, just basically anecdotal, but instead using a coding process that you have a thorough and detailed analysis that is comprehensive, where themes are based on multiple quotes from multiple participants, and that you are accurately explaining what those participants actually said. So check the themes against the original data set to make sure that they're accurately representing those views of participants. And make sure that they're coherent, they're consistent, and that each theme is distinctive. They all shouldn't say the same thing, just reworded. When you're doing analysis, make sure that you're not siloing your data. You want to make sure that you're going through and ensuring that each theme is fully telling the story, that you are balancing the analytic narrative with any illustrative extracts of data that you're providing. So make it very clear on conclusions that you drew based on the multiple quotes from each of the individual participants. So you want to make sure that when you're doing your analysis, you're following a process that has been detailed and outlined in the qualitative research and sources that you based your proposal on. So when you're presenting codes and themes, usually each theme is based on multiple categories and multiple codes and the quotes that are assigned to them. Keep in mind again, and I can't stress this enough, your themes are always based on the quotes, where codes and categories are just used to capture those segments of data. So so you can explain what categories and codes that the segments of data were used for each individual theme. So for example, this theme came from the categories, the data that had categories of collaboration, communication, understanding. I may have 5 other themes, and communication may be in 3 of them. Collaboration may be in 2 of the themes. So it's really important to make sure that as you are doing your analysis, that you explain these relationships to your reader. And I'll show you an example because I think it's going to be easier to see it that way. So here's an example of coding. I just put some things in quotes that I'm going to potentially use in the analysis. But technically, this whole thing is the quote of what the participants said in my transcript. But I just put these in quotes here so that you can see that I'm going to use this quotation in my analysis and my write-up or my tables, or maybe some figures to show the relationships among these things. But here's a transcript. So you see this is the question that I asked. Then this is the participant's response. I have the participant number here. So I have a pseudonym so that they've been de-identified. And then I'm reading through and they're like, all right, they're talking about sense of belonging. So I'm going to put sense of belonging here. Oh, they're talking about uncertainty. I'm going to code that as uncertainty. More sense of belonging here. So I'm seeing a pattern. They're talking about sense of belonging a lot. Now they're talking about self-awareness and self-reflection. So I'm going to code that to here. I'm reading here, and they're talking about what they're that they're feeling valued and appreciated. Well, that's different than these concepts, and it relates to my project question. So I'm going to code that as green. So this is what coding looks like. This is just going through and taking the transcripts and looking for key concepts and start assigning these concepts or segments of data to labels that I have created. I may also look at some type of code frequency or word counts. So once you actually do this coding, then I think, so you'll do this to all of your transcripts. You'll go in and code transcript number 1, transcript number 2, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But then at some point, it's important to start taking all of the data that are assigning these codes and grouping them together. I find it's better to do it in Excel. You can do it in Word if you want. But somewhere in your analysis process, you should have sense of belonging as a code, and then every single quote from those participants should be captured somewhere in some document. And then you can start looking at, how often were these codes used? So that's what code frequency is. So for example, sense of belonging, 8 different participants mentioned concepts related to that, and I captured 15 quotes related to sense of belonging. I like to count these things not for purposes of quantifying the data, where I'm doing quantitative analysis. That's not what I'm doing. What I'm looking for is just the weight of it. How many times did I capture quotes across number of participants? Because if only 2 participants said something, then maybe it's not as going to be representative of a theme of all the participants. But if all participants mention something, or 9 of them, that's a lot. And if many people mention, for example, feeling valued and appreciated, I know it was mentioned a lot because I captured 18 segments of data. It's just a way in order to understand a little bit as far as some of the frequency that some of these concepts are coming up with. So normally I just, in Word, in Microsoft Excel, I'll just put my codes, the definition of that code, how many participants I captured quotes from, and the number of quotes that I put. So maybe a little bit of counting. Then I usually have in my Excel file, this is the categories. So these are all my codes that I have. This is the definition of my category, and all these relate to, for example, relationship. All of these codes relate to discipline and structure. Again, I'm just organizing my codes and categories in order to group like things together so I can better manage my data. But keep in mind, to each of these codes, I have segments of data still assigned to these, usually in another tab. Then I may have some themes that have been developed. So I may have, this is my final theme list, and this is some example quotes. So when you're doing your analysis, I just want to show you some Excel files that you can create to kind of show what that analysis is going to look like. I can then create some figures that I'm going to use. So for all of my 6 themes, these are the categories the data was pulled from to develop these themes. So for example, finance, data was used in the finance categories for 2 themes, theme number 6 and theme number 1. Relationship, I use data on multiple of them, almost all of them, for data within the relationship. So it just shows the relationship among your themes and your categories. What we look for in this is that it shouldn't be a one-to-one relationship. So theme number one shouldn't be based on these two. Theme number two shouldn't then be based on this one. So you want to make sure that you don't silo your data. You want to make sure that you've looked at across all of your data to come up with your themes. So, and you can see here that this study actually did, and I can see that because of this relationship here. So if I look for each of my themes, for example, I'm going to then have, these are all the quotes that support that theme directly. And so I organize it in Excel before I do any of my write-up, because then when I actually do my write-up, I can say, you know, these three quotes are so related, I can put these in a table because it's very clear how these quotes align to this theme. But these quotes need some more context. So for example, quote number 4, they were answering questions when they were about what they were doing to consider being highly engaged over the long term. I need to explain what type of question they were responding to. So these quotes, or some of these quotes, may be better in my actual write-up, where I give the additional context or explanation. And then it's really important to make sure that you keep track of which participants said each of these quotes. And then for your write-up, you can use these quotes as needed and explain the patterns that have emerged. So let's look at what an example write-up would be. So you'll go through and, for example, talk about how you develop your codes and categories. So your coding was a process where you were taking large segments of data. You read through the interviews a number of times. You started to look for things that were talked about. During the first few rounds, you maybe came up with 45 descriptive statements and long sentences. You developed some preliminary codes. You combined all of the transcripts together. Any items that you coded that had less than 3 quotes or only were mentioned by a single participant, you then recoded to see if you could collapse some of those codes. And then you ended up with 31 preliminary codes using an open coding process following Braun and Clark, and so forth. So you're just explaining exactly what you did in your coding process. Then you basically could say, for example, the patterns connected groups of initial codes into 17 final codes. And then you can give a table that shows your actual final code list. So these are your codes, this is the definition, and here are some example quotes that support each of these codes that you have here. If you use code frequency, so I had that in my Excel spreadsheet before, this is the number of times the code was used to label or capture a segment of data, which participants actually the quotes came from. So for example, this code, I captured 77 quotes or phrases that were assigned to this code, and 10 participants, maybe out of my 12 participants, actually is where these quotes came from. So upon then analyzing those codes further, you then took those 17 codes and then you put them into actual categories. So the actual categories are just showing, here's my category, and these are the codes that were similar in nature that I grouped them under these categories. Keep in mind, when you're doing your analysis, you're basing the analysis in your themes on the quotes that are assigned to these codes and categories. But for now, you're just showing how you developed codes and categories, and so they can see those labels that you created. And then you're just writing up about the results. You're explaining your table and what's included in those tables. When you developed your themes, explain how you then analyze the relationship among the data within those codes and categories. And then you can put in your figure, for example, in your document that shows the relationship among your codes and your categories. When you're writing up your results, you may want to have a theme summary table that shows all of your themes together and some example participant quotes. So it's really important to organize this, I think, first somewhere else, maybe like in Excel. And then once you have your analysis complete written up, then you can start writing the narrative where you're just taking the data that you have previously captured and organized. So once you go through all of your themes, I recommend then having a heading for each theme individually, where you explain exactly how this theme emerged. So for example, theme number 1, the first theme identified was, and then just explain the actual theme. explain, these were the codes and the categories that the data were found in. And then you may have an example table. This is my theme, and these are example participant quotes. If you have a table, these quotes should directly relate and be very clear how they relate to this theme. If the quote needs more description, context, or you need to explain what type of interview question they were responding to, that should be in the paragraphs that follow. But I like to explain, how did the theme emerge? Here are some example quotes. And then usually I have a subheading then where I break up each of the components of the theme to talk about the story, to talk about the how the theme emerged for part of that sentence. So for example, organizational leaders are in a position to improve engagement by creating a supportive environment. If that is the theme, then I have engagement. And I talk about, this is what participants actually said. All the participants agreed on this. Some participants disagreed by saying such and such. There was consensus, among some, but then others stated the opposite. You're just telling the story of what the data said for this individual theme. So again, talking about supportive environment, I may have then a subsection on support where I go through and create the link of how this organizational leadership and this engagement then created the supportive environment. What did participants say about creating the supportive environment? And I walk through the actual data of what participants actually said. And then once I do that for each theme, I explain each theme. I've got a heading for each theme, subheadings for the main components under each theme. Say I have 7 themes. Then at the end, I'm going to do a summary of the themes. And I'm going to explain, how did all of my themes relate to and answer the project question? What were the major findings? What did I come up with all together? What were the key conclusions? And what are the key points of the analysis once I look at all of these themes? So normally I have a summary section, and then you can just also talk about how you mitigated any bias in your analysis. The best way to look at how analysis was done is to go look at example projects. So this is just, I took segments here that I'm showing you. Go look at some completed dissertations or some completed capstone projects to see, how did students write up their analysis? Even if they're working in a different template than you, look across multiple students to see what they did when they wrote up their results. So when you're doing your analysis, there are potential pitfalls to avoid when you're looking for themes. One is the failure to actually analyze the data at all. Thematic analysis is not just a collection of extracts strung together. So sometimes some students will say, this is my theme, and then they just give a bunch of quotes. And the key thing is, you want to actually analyze the data. You want to look for the patterns and the relationships of what people were saying. So if someone is talking about project management and their techniques and how it reduced cost, you're looking at the relationship where everyone talked about various techniques in relation to cost. So a theme isn't just going to be multiple participants talked about reducing cost, and this is what they said about cost, and then just give a bunch of quotes. The key thing is that you have to analyze it in context of everything else that they said. So and maybe cost is the result of these action steps or strategies that were taken. So if multiple participants said the same thing, led to cost reduction, that could be something that is a theme. So it's not just things that people talk about a lot. That's not a theme. The theme is talking about, what are the actual perspectives in relation to the project question. Another pitfall is if you're just using data collection and you're saying the themes are the answers to individual interview questions. That's not a good way to organize your data as well, or to organize your analysis. So for example, if you have 12 interview questions and say that, all right, these 3 interview questions are similar, these were the responses, and this is the grouping of those responses. So you want to make sure that you're using your interview guide and the themes from the overall data, not individual responses from interview questions. Any weak or unconvincing analysis, a mismatch between the data and the actual analytic claims that are made, where the analysis is not supported by the data. This is really the number one thing that I see. And so again, I'll give you the example. If I'm doing a study on project management and multiple participants said that they are using a work breakdown structure in order to start a project. I cannot in my write-up write it is critical to use a work breakdown structure when starting a project. Because if I'm the reader of that project and I look at it, I'll look for quotes, and I'll look for quotes of which participants said it was critical, which participants said it was important, which participants said this was a key requirement. And if I don't see any quotes in the analysis of the write-up, that is going to be definitely a red flag that you are not representing the perspective of participants. You are giving your own perspective or drawing a conclusion beyond what the data represented. The only reason I could potentially say that starting with a work breakdown structure is critical is if multiple participants said it was critical, important, or a very necessary step in starting a study. The other way would be is if I asked participants, can you describe the most important strategies for starting a project in order to ensure success? And then multiple people said and described how they used a work breakdown structure for success. I could then state that that is important because they were responding to a question where I asked them to describe something that was important. So, but again, that's not going to come across in my data because they may not have represented in any of those quotes I captured or coded the word important or critical. So then that's in my write-up where I need to explain when asked questions about what was important or critical, multiple participants stated. So you need to give the context. You need to give the context of how the answer in the theme allowed you to draw the conclusion that something was important or something was critical. But this is the number one mistakes that usually I see in qualitative inquiry, where the actual theme is not representative of the actual perspective of participants. And the number one way I check it is I will read the theme to a student and I'll say, can you please tell me which quotes you use of what participants actually said this. So if someone said it can reduce cost, I will say, show me the quotes where someone said that what you're saying actually reduces costs. And if they say, well, participants didn't actually say that, but my project question is about reducing costs, so the whole study relates to that. That's not how to do analysis. Analysis must represent the perspective of participants. It's the number one reason your project would or research would not be accepted is because you actually are making claims beyond what the data is presented. Or the data is actually there and you have rich data, you just haven't explained it well enough in your study. So you want to make sure that there's not a mismatch between the actual response of participants and what you wrote up in the study. You also want to make sure that there's not a mismatch between the theory and the analytic claims, between the research questions and your theoretical constructs that you use to start your study. So if you find some things are not making sense, go and compare it to your concepts in the applied framework to make sure that you're accurately drawing the correct conclusion based on what's known as well. It's just another way to check your actual analysis. So I mentioned some of these already, but first, siloing the data is where you are taking a theme and where you're just turning a category into a theme, or you're collapsing categories into a theme, and then you're ignoring those categories for all of the other themes. So you want to make sure that, like I said, look at all of your data and come up with theme number one. Take a step back, look at all of your data again, come up with theme number two. Let's take a step back, look at all of your data, theme number three. So make sure to analyze the data, make sure that you're not having any bias or incomplete analysis, extracting quotes or segments of data without considering their context. Some of the context could be the interview question that you asked, developing themes that didn't actually address your project question, your research question. This happens oftentimes as well. Some people will say, well, this was talked about extensively. But if it doesn't relate to your project question, your research question, or the purpose, then it's not meant to be a theme. It may have been talked about a lot. Maybe someone got off on a tangent. Maybe you had interview questions that weren't directly wholly applicable to your project question. Just because something was talked about a lot doesn't mean it actually answers your project question. And then lastly, and this is where you could really get into some trouble with compliance, is if you have not documented the process of how you coded your data, how you coded the transcripts, how you cleaned up the transcripts, how you actually categorized those codes, and that you have a cohesive documentation of your analysis process. So if you, for example, in your analysis, you've got a table that says, I have code frequency, or so if I have the code communication and the code frequency is 25, that means I've coded 25 quotes to the communication code. Someone should be able to say, can you show me in your documents where there are 25 quotes assigned to that code? You should be able to show where that is. That is how you document your process. If you don't document your process or don't have your analysis where it's clear and laid out, then you run into some compliance issues, and it's best just to avoid that in your study. So that is everything for data analysis. I hope you have a better understanding of how to do coding, how to put those into categories, how to develop your themes, and some best practices in following your data analysis process. I wish you the best of luck with your study, and thanks.